My name is Malone and I'm the creative coordinator of the Molly's Masquerade. I'm also the director of Heads, Bodies, Legs, who are partnered with St Margaret's House to deliver this year-long heritage lottery project, which explores the 18th century Mollies and the Molly houses. So today we're going to be talking to Dan Glass, and we're going to be talking about the Society for the Reformation of Good Manners. Okay, it's quite a heavy topic, so we're going to have to go at speed to deliver quite a lot of content. But we have also quite a few of the facilitators, creative facilitators for the project here. And so something for you to be thinking about, and all the other participants, is to be thinking about some of the content that we're delivering and this history and how it could tie in to the workshops that we're going to be doing and the work that we're going to be creating over this year. If you can put your questions in a chat box as they come up, and then we'll try and get to them at the end. So first of all, I'd like to introduce Dan Glass, who I am really chuffed is involved in this project. And yeah, Dan, can you introduce yourself and tell us about everything you do?
Yes, good to see you, everyone. I am an activist. You can see the poster in the back of Ray's room, the 120 BPM, which was a film about ACT UP Paris, which ACT UP stands for AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power. And Ray and me and Dan and Matthew and various others here have been part of ACT UP London. ACT UP started in 1987 in response to the AIDS epidemic. And is a global direct action movement for fighting for healthcare for all. And we'll go on to talk a bit more about some of the lessons that we can learn about fighting the AIDS epidemic that we can apply to fighting the corona pandemic across the world. But over the years, it's been a joy to be an activist with Ray and so many others, creating a whole range of different kind of creative responses to the privatisation of the NHS, to the cuts to healthcare services, to fight for PrEP. Just a few examples that we've done. It's a kind of combination of both direct actions and creative performances. Ray and me are also trainers with, I've got my book over there, my computer's really crap. If I move, it just switches off. So I'll pick it up in the middle, don't move. The book is called Beautiful Trouble, beautifultrouble.org. And it's an incredible resource toolkit of creative activists and artists across the world, full of methodologies, tactics, strategies, and case studies of all kinds of creative actions to challenge many kinds of injustices. So beautifultrouble.org is the training that we do. But then this other book, which I can't actually reach over to because, again, the computer will switch off, is by an incredible activist and artist called Sarah Schulman, who was really with ACT UP New York since the beginning, was also one of the founders of the Lesbian Avengers in New York. But this book is called The Gentrification of the Mind, Witness to a Lost Imagination, which I'll talk a bit more about as well, which is very relevant to the Society for Reformation of Good Manners. But just to finish on some of the projects that we've done over the last little while, 5-6 years since we reformed ACT UP London, one of my favourite things is HIV Blind Date, which we do every World AIDS Day, which hopefully we'll see if we can do it this year around December the 1st. But when Cilla Black left the building, we were like, well, how, looking at the relevance of blind date and dating shows to people who are stigmatized when it comes to living with HIV and other stigmatized conditions. So we do a dating show, but just weaving in questions about HIV, hepatitis, stigma, activism, but in the format of blind date. That's one of the examples of the shows that we've done. Some of the examples of the actions that we've done. On April Fool's Day 2016, we had a global action on 6 different continents on the same day called Pharma Greed Kills, where we challenged pharmaceutical greed and government inaction and the raising of the price of drugs, which should be readily and universally available. And in the London action, we went to Gilead's headquarters in Holborn, focusing on Gilead because they weren't prioritising and providing pre-exposure prophylaxis, which is now thankfully being released in nearly the scale it needs to be. And 5 activists took their clothes off with greed, or GREED, on 5 people's bums in the windows to really challenge and stop business as usual and say something needs to be done. One of my last favourite actions, which I can never recommend big piles of horseshit enough for different acts of civil disobedience, really easy but smelly way to stop business as usual and challenge fascism and tyranny. We went at the time, Nigel Farage and UKIP were out in the press saying, frankly, the last kind of migrants we should allow into the UK are those living with HIV. So we went to their South London office very early in the morning of World AIDS Day, December the 1st, and dumped half a ton of horse shit on their garage door with a red ribbon over it, with a message on the back on the garage which said stop spreading filth, solidarity on World AIDS Day, healthcare for all, amongst many other recent actions. But I will talk more about some of the more legendary ACT UP actions which have happened across the world since '87. And it's also very poignant because Larry Kramer, the founder of ACT UP, passed away last week, who was a big proponent of harnessing our anger in a powerful and positive way, and not denying our anger for the greater common good. And I've been thinking about anger a lot because I'm sure, like a lot of you, we've been quite angry at how as Naomi Klein talks about, the shock doctrine, how our rights and civil liberties are being taken away before our eyes by this fucking government during the corona pandemic. And so that is also very relevant to challenging the kind of former current manifestations of the Society for Reformation of Good Manners. So I hope that gave a little insight into some of the activism that Ray and me and ACT UP do.
Yeah, good. Just also referring to like what is happening right now outside of this chat in the world as far as the Black Lives Matter protests. Like, we can't talk about the 18th century without acknowledging the slave trade and the colonial past. And this is happening this is the background to the Molly's project. And I don't want to like talk about it in a brief way, because we're going to devote significant time with Queer Tours of London to doing a Black History tour in September. But I have been trying to educate myself and read as much as possible over the last few weeks. And something I was listening to very recently was Akala's Natives. I was listening to that on the audiobook. And at one point, Akala was talking about the racist abuse that Diane Abbott receives, and talking about on Twitter, and a calling for her to be hung on Twitter. But he says, and I'll just read you his quote, that it seems Britain's most honest racists emphasise the spiritual connection they feel for their American cousins quite well. Yet in reality, the hanging of Black people was never a particular phenomenon in domestic Britain. Ironically, the vast majority of people hung in British history were white, and they were often poor people hung by the state for not respecting rich people's property. So we're going to come back a little bit later to discuss the relationship between the slave trade and the Reformation for Good Manners. But first of all, just for anybody who doesn't know, our project is primarily around the Mollies and the Molly houses. Dan, can you tell us anything about the Molly houses? What were they like?
Yes. The Molly houses, and I'm going to give one of my favourite examples just round the corner from me in Whitechapel. The Molly houses, I'm going to read a bit and then I'm going to give an example. The evidence we have of Molly houses shows a vibrant, joyful world of men who pursue both homosexual experiences and a distinct lifestyle. They usually consisted of a large open room for music, dancing and drinking, and several private rooms in the back where men could get married and have sex. Men who frequented them were often christened with female names, sometimes having to do with their physical features or professions. Cross-dressing was also a commonplace, as was the use of affected and effeminate language. I just want to give an example. One of my favourite things with Queer Tours of London, and as Ray said, we'll go more into that in the next workshop. But in brief, we started Queer Tours of London at the end of 2016 in the smokers' corner, in the smokers' backyard of the Joiners Arms, which I'm sure a lot of us have frequented in Hackney Road, because we were very aware of the mass slaughter of queer spaces, which is now more, well, pre-corona was a third of LGBT plus spaces in London have been shut because of turbo capitalism and mass gentrification. And now I barely even want to think about it, but like the impacts on queer spaces, bars, clubs, community spaces, support services could be like tragically worse because of the impacts of the corona pandemic. And one thing I've been thinking a lot about is what is deemed as essential and non-essential services and spaces. And of course, who defines that is the establishment, the status quo, the Tory government. And they decide what's essential. And of course, their world is so far removed from the mass of ordinary people who rely on the amenities which they have really no understanding about. But we'll talk more about essential and non-essential and how that kind of continues through history. But Queer Tours of London was started as an immersive, comprehensive way to understand our incredible queer history or herstory, and really celebrate that and harness history to continue the ongoing journey for freedom today. And when there isn't physical spaces, then we'll just recreate them on the streets, in the woods, in various other places that we have. So we curate lots of different tours in different areas of London. And as one of the sayings that we say is, every street, every building has a queer history. It's just because of institutional homophobia and centuries of compounded homophobia that we haven't been allowed to find out about them. So when we do the curation, personally, I like getting requests for different areas of London where we haven't curated tours before. We've got with Dan, who's on here, just pumping up his pillows at the moment, is a legendary queer tour guide in Soho and many other places, but we've done ones like Brixton Dykes on the Rampage with the Rebel Dykes in Brixton, with Gay Liberation Front, also around Soho, but in Hackney. But one area where we did recently was Whitechapel and Wapping. And at first you could think like, well, what's Wapping? What's Whitechapel got to do with queer history? But when you do the research, when you sit in places like Bishopsgate Institute or other archives across London, it's so easy to find out some of the instances. And 74 Whitechapel Road, which is now the NatWest Bank, was one of the most legendary molly houses in the 18th century, called Miss Muff's Molly House. And then when you're curating the tours, you obviously do a recce beforehand, practice how long it will take to do the tour route. And I loved going in there and being like, do you know what this place used to be 3 centuries? They're like, no. And then you talk about Miss Muff's Molly House and they're like, do you want to start up a bank account or can you just get out? So it is absolutely incredible, and it really brings to life our community, which has been silenced. And there's so many parallels of that with what's happening with Black Lives Matter as well.
Okay, we're going to cover quite a lot of topics to say, and like Dan said, we're going to do 5 tours with Queer Tours, and myself and Dan will be doing a beautiful trouble training, and so hopefully that will be a development of the conversations that we're starting today. But for anybody who doesn't know, which I imagine there's a lot of them, is are the Society for the Reformation of Good Manners. Dan, can you tell us who they are?
The Society for the Reformation of Good Manners was founded, the title is brilliant, was founded in Tower Hamlets in 1691. Its aims were the suppression of profanity, immorality, and other lewd activities in general, and brothels and prostitution in particular. The society was arranged in 40 society of original gentlemen at the top. Lawyers, judges, and MPs provided the financing to enable prosecutions. Then the second society, tradesmen, and whose role it was to suppress vice. Among other methods, they employed a blacklist, which they published annually to shame the alleged offenders. Association of constables, who took an active role in arresting their victims. Finally, the fourth layer consisted of informers, a network of moral guardians throughout the city of London. The produced printed pamphlets sought to prevent vice by using the courts to publish those for offences including swearing, Sabbath breaking, drunkenness, lewd and disorderly contact, brothel keeping, gaming and sodomy. They were the most active in the first part of the 18th century, and over a 40-year period they were responsible for over 100,000 prosecutions.
So I just want to mention as well this notion of manners, which sounds really prim from a contemporary standpoint, but actually manners was more than just decent behaviour. It was basically, what's that noise? So basically, yeah, sort of the manners refers to the qualities of mankind living together in peace and unity. So it's actually quite a grand subject, although it sounds a bit pompous in like kind of contemporary language. Because good manners was closely associated with divinely sanctioned Christian moral teachings, the hierarchy of man under God, masters over men, and women under men. Bad manners threaten the social subordination of the government over the nation. So at the time, the aristocracy were deemed as acting immorally, but the middle classes couldn't pass judgment on them. So they basically focused on changing the behaviour of the poor. And we'd just come out of the 17th century being an extremely kind of puritanical, patriarchal era. And up until this, young people and women would have been wholly dependent on their relationships to their parents or their employers or their husbands. And now, for a variety of reasons, people had, women and young people had a lot more freedom in the cities. And so to counter this, they enforced moral control. And this is who the Reformation of Good Manners were. There was also some like sibling kind of groups, which were the promotion of Christian morals. And later on, they became like the Reformation of Vice. Okay, so who were the victims of the Reformation of Good Manners? Dan, can you tell us?
Yeah. Most Mollies were working class men. Their jobs were really in the realms of servants, messenger boys, chairmen, coachmen, footmen, waiter, atterman, artisans or skilled craftsmen, cabinet makers, gilders, don't know how to pronounce that, peruke makers, tailor, fan makers, upholsterers, tradesmen, fruit sellers, butchers, hardware dealers, woolen drapers, suppliers of services, barber, tavern keeper, porter, postboy, workers of various skills, candle maker, wool comber, silk dyer, blacksmith, not a few foot soldiers, few schoolmasters and gentlemen of independent means.
So loads of working class men, basically. Now we've got loads of history of the aristocracy acting really sexually and gay kings. But what is really kind of unique about this history is it's the history of the gay working class and gay working class men. Also, I mean, one of the first victims that they had was Captain Rigby, who wasn't working class, but they really set an example of him. Captain Rigby was kind of like this gay libertine who had been tried for sodomy and acquitted, and then a reverend tried to entrap him with a young servant. And in his defense in the court, he referenced lots of like great famous gay men. And interestingly, he said, because the messenger was like, oh, I don't know how to do it. How do men have sex? And he was like, well, and he'd said that he'd witnessed the Tsar of Russia, Peter the Great, sleeping with his servant in a ship in Bournemouth. And basically this could probably have happened. I just find it really interesting because it's Russian Tsars. So it's quite an interesting case. Like, look him up if you can, Captain Rigby. But yeah, basically that he was given a £1,000 fine, which he paid quite easily. So he's clearly kind of a moneyed guy. And then he was put in the pillories, which would have been quite common to have shit pelted at you, like literally. And then he escaped, actually. He escaped and he went to France and he converted to Catholicism and then carried on the life of a libertine. So he's a bit of a cool character, but the majority of the people who were punished were working class men. So how were they punished? Dan, can you tell me about sodomy?
I love it. In our preparatory notes, it says in bright purple, Dan, can you tell me about sodomy in capital letters? And sometimes I realise that my life isn't too hard. Throughout the 18th century and up until 1861, all penetrative homosexual acts committed by men were punishable by death. Following this date, hanging was replaced by life imprisonment. Relatively few men were actually found guilty of sodomy. Few still were executed. For most of this period, to prove sodomy, one needed at least 2 eyewitnesses and evidence of both penetration and ejaculation. The threat of a charge of sodomy or sodomitical assault was frequently used as the basis for extortion. Homosexuality was seen as a contagion that could infect society, and the worst insult someone which would use was sodomite dog. Can I just add one thing there, on top of the definition of sodomy? I just want to pick up on the bit, sorry, if I do talk too fast, just shout at me on the chat. On the bit about contagion, as homosexuality being contagious, like the parallels and the consequences of that are still so relevant now if we're looking at the othering in society, both in the AIDS epidemic, both very much so in the corona pandemic. Who's being othered, who's being suppressed, who's being exploited, and who's being triggered or activated by this seen to be as infectious culture. Communities who've already been othered throughout history, it can be quite activating when we kind of still use that language. But just to finish on a specific example of when the contagion language is still used. Jarek, who's on the call, thank you for sending me the latest link about what's going on in Poland. They've just released, the Law and Justice Party have just released their equivalent manifesto to what we had, Section 28, between 1988 and 2003. And I went recently, sometime recently, I think last year, to Poland to do to present a film around what the Law and Justice Party, their attacks on the queer community. And they say 2 things, both that homosexuals are the reason for the downfall of civilization, which is, it's hard, you can almost want to take credit for that. And then that we're contagious. So what we did, we went round one of the fascist anti-pride demonstrations and shook hands with as many of them as possible, just to spread the awful disease of gayness. So these kind of language of contagion has been going for centuries, and it's still something that we've got to challenge.
Absolutely. I also just want to give a bit of context to this time. So the legal system during the 18th century was known as the Bloody Code, which was because of the amount of crimes that were punishable by death. So it rose from 50 to 220 different crimes were punishable by death by the end of the 18th century. So even a lot of them were to do with theft and to do with pickpocketing, and just theft could be punished by hanging. It was also a time when we developed, or Britain developed, my family were Irish, but so not me. But the 18th century, the British developed the system of mass incarceration, and most people were in prison for debt. I'm going to share with you a little bit of, if I can share screen, let's go. Host disabled, attendee screen sharing. Can you, you might have to make me the host, Stuart. Can you make me the host too? So yeah, just talking to you a bit about how they were punished, so that we know that, thank you. One of the most interesting things I found here was this is, let me just move my screen around. This is the annual records of the Society for the Reformation of Good Manners. And you can see what people were prosecuted for. So we've got sodomy, because actually it was really hard to prove, because you had to have 2 eyewitnesses who saw penetration and ejaculation. So it's really difficult to actually get enough people in court to prosecute people for sodomy. But what they would have been prosecuted for was under lewd and disorderly conduct. or attempted sodomy. But here you can see the exact figures that they were keeping for people who were keeping bawdly or disorderly houses. These would have been molly houses: Sabbath breaking, profanity and swearing, drunkenness, keeping common gaming houses. But one of the most kind of unique or distinctive parts of this period is actually how many women were prosecuted. And so you can see in 1700, there's 682 females compared to 161 males. And it's really unique as a period because generally, like now, I think 15% of the prison population are women, whereas up to at the time it would have been 50% and much more workhouse. So we know as well that some of the mollies were hung during this time, which is not there under sodomy, so it would have come under here. Like 1703, there were 3 men executed in Maidstone in Kent. We also know in 1707 that 40 men were arrested in a molly house and 2 of them killed themselves before the trial. But this is a reference as unnatural lewdness or attempted sodomy. But yeah, by far the biggest target for the Society for the Reformation of Manners was sex workers. And just to talked about before, that most women had no education or very little earning potential. So the chances are that some of them may have been working as maids or street seamstresses, but this was unreliable work. And so a lot of them worked as sex workers, and many of them would have been begging on the streets as well. And there was also just generally like a social anxiety about the sexual powers and the dangers of women, particularly unmarried women who were living independent of fathers or husbands. And during this time of like the early 18th century, 80% of women who appeared at the Old Bailey on property charges were unmarried. So it really was like an attack on single women and sex workers. And many of them, as I said, in the 1770s, there was 90 separate workhouses in London. Now, some of the workhouses were like, there were good things to say in the sense that there were charities as well. So some of them did provide medical care, but often they were there to punish. Many people contracted diseases and died within the walls, and later were buried in unmarked mass paupers' graves. One of the most interesting statistics I found, or awful statistics I found, was in the 1750s, a social investigator, Jonas Hanway, discovered that the death rate amongst workhouse children in London was over 90%. Like, it was brutal. So yeah, also during this time, that we also, because of the mass incarceration of people, Britain, I've got to stop saying we, Britain created the Transportation Act. Dan, can you tell us what the Transportation Act is, please?
Yeah. The Transportation Act, introduced in 1718, meant criminals were transported to the colonies, first the US and then Australia. Approximately 50,000 convicts, men, women and children, were transported to North America, and from 1718, 68,000 were transported to Australia. Many died on the journey. Those that survived would work and then become free members of society, unlike African slaves.
Okay. Also, we're going to start chatting properly to everybody soon, but I wanted to also, a great book that I read was Governing Morals, A Social History on Moral Regulation by Alan Hunt. And Hunt says that the Society for the Reformation of Manners marks the period in which the working class becomes an object of governmental regulation. One of the most important characteristics was that it was an urban target. The street and the places of public resort, so fairs and theatres, were its capital targets. These sites were characterised by social unruliness, not just unruly people, but unruly categories of people. Categories captured well by the phrase masterless men, those that live outside the structures of authority, and even more to the point, masterless women, which I really like, masterless women. With attempts to suppress riotous games, carnivals, and other popular festivities, the maypole as a primitive fertility ritual ends, with May festivities today having become a sanitised public holiday. And some aspects of popular culture, which had previously been shared within the whole community, become increasingly moralised and subjected to external pressures from reform. For example, when the landowning classes become estranged from the popular rituals that become viewed as pagan. I was just quite interested in this reference to the pagan as well, from anybody who attended the puppetry Zoom and looking at the Molly's birthing rituals as a kind of ancient pagan ritual. So yeah, just to kind of to kind of recap on some of it, can anybody think of ways that now, what are the contemporary examples of perhaps festivals or rituals or pagan cultures that we have any on? Or alternatively as well, I think more of an important question is things that I think we should all be reflecting on. Is this time as known as like a period of moral regulation, of controlling the poor? What are the contemporary, who would be the Society of the Reformation of Manners today? Like, who is it who are the busybodies who are interested in people's sex lives or controlling people's personal lives? Does anybody have any thoughts? Sorry?
The government.
The government.
Yeah.
The Daily Mail.
You've got Windrush. You've got Windrush. You've got the benefit system. You've got the privatisation of the NHS. You had Section 28. There's concerns over trans rights at the moment. I mean, everything. And they excuse that, yeah, on morality and religion, and so yeah, that's what I would say.
Protests against sex education in Birmingham that were happening.
Yeah. I'm just going to write these down. Has anybody got any others?
Columnists in the Daily Mail, people like Sarah Vine and people like that.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think trial by TV is much bigger at the moment. Exactly.
How do you mean trial by TV?
Well, trial by Piers Morgan. You don't need to pass a law if you can make someone get enough death threats, enough Twitter abuse, and enough kind of scrutiny in the public eye to be terrorized away, and people genuinely lose their jobs from that stuff and lose their positions.
Just gonna have a quick.
Steffi said, Twitter, we judge and cancel all the time.
Yep.
They tried to pass a law banning, they failed, but we had some great protests around it, banning sex education to girls in schools at the age of 12, but not boys. This is about 3 years ago. Yeah.
They tried to ban sex education for girls?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it didn't get through, but it was a Tory, it had quite a few signees. There was also the face-sitting protests. You remember the face-sitting protests?
Oh, yeah.
So they updated, do you remember, Dan? It was great. They updated the 1950s legislation for the internet age around pornographic materials. But of course, those pornographic materials banned anything that had anything to do with female or vaginal sexuality, so cis female or vaginal sexuality. So it included saying squirting was a dangerous act or a violent act. Female ejaculation was essentially a non-existent violent act. And this is actually passed. These laws have passed and are being used to regulate porn. And a lot of friends of mine lost their porn businesses, their feminist porn businesses actually, and had huge trials and had their names exposed in the media and stuff. But basically, I had a long list of. It was obviously banning S&M and anything dominatrixy, because that was very kind of in the 50s zeitgeist. But also just loads of anything to do with vaginas, basically.
Anybody else? There's just a couple more things that I wanted to mention from the research. I think just to notice that, like, actually, who were they? Who were the members of the Society for the Reformation manners. I've been trying to Google it. I was like partly like, are they slave owners? But one of them, like we know, there's just a couple of them that I was going to mention, the more famous ones, like John Gonson was the one who is referenced in the Hogarth paintings that we talked about before, and is satirized by Hogarth as somebody who's obsessed with other people's sex lives. This like hypocrisy was noted at the time. There's a really great quote from Daniel Defoe, who says, "We of the plebly find ourselves justly aggrieved in all of the work of the Reformation. This is because the just and necessary laws are enforced against us, but not against you. These are all cobweb laws, in which small flies are catched, but the great ones break through. 'Tis hard, gentlemen, to be punished for a crime by a man as guilty as ourselves." Which he's like, yeah, hypocritical bastards, basically, yes. Really like that quote. Also, one of the most kind of poignant, relevant facts that I found was about William Wilberforce. Do we know William Wilberforce?
He was to do with the slave trade.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So he's kind of, he's famous for being an anti-slavery campaigner. He was a British MP from Hull and an evangelical Christian. There's lots of films made about him. Also, Akala was like, he's given a lot more credence than people. They're basically like, he stopped the slave trade individually without actually taking into account the slave resistance in Haiti.
I think you're doing in schools, yeah.
Yeah, by Toussaint Louverture. But the reason that I mention Wilberforce is that he was the founding member of the Society for the Reformation of Vice, which was the successor to the Society of the Reformation of Manners. And there's a quote by him that says, "God Almighty has set before me two great objects, the suppression of the slave trade and the reformation of manners." So I think it's quite interesting from this point is that, or more complicated from a contemporary point of view, that the person who was in government and was doing most to secure freedom for the enslaved people was also a large part of the people who were oppressing single mothers, single women, and homosexual men. And so I think that's why this talk should just be the start of it, because I feel like this is such a massive topic that could do with so much more research. And it's really, for me, like understanding the controls that were set then and we're living under now. Just on that, I was wondering if you've got a response to that, Dan, just what I've been saying.
Yeah, how long do I have? Well, I guess my main thought is about the kind of macro modern parallels of Society for the Reformation of Good Manners, essentially policing the masses, is how we begin to police ourselves, particularly, you know, in the current climate. There's many people in here which are fans of popular education, Nina, who's also here. We've done lots of work around theatre of the oppressed and popular education.
Down.
Oh, sorry, yeah, sorry, I talked so fast.
You talk so fast. It's a young men's thing. But what you've got to say is so good.
Yeah. Sorry. Paulo Freire is one of the kind of founding figures of popular education. And one of the reflections on what we've talked about so far is when he says, when the oppressed becomes the oppressor. And in this case, when we do the establishment's work for them and police ourselves as communities, so conditioned by the tyrannical mainstream kind of warfare going on. And the particular quote that I always think back to is becoming ventriloquists of power, how we hear the conditioning of the establishment's narrative or in previous areas of the Society for the Reformation of Good Manners and just do their work for them. And I think that's just so important today when there's a lot of kind of policing culture going on, which obviously completely negates and doesn't shine the light on the corruption coming down from the government. So that's my first thought. And then the second reflection, and I always try and not bring in the Holocaust into everything I talk about, but that's my kind of main kind of learning ground when it comes to how the oppressed becomes the oppressor and how we police each other with the dominator culture's good narrative, good manners narrative. An amazing activist who I work with is called Ruth Barnett, who's a Holocaust survivor herself. And one thing that she said, which has always stuck in my mind, is how the Nazi Holocaust or any genocides, slavery, modern forms of othering, didn't happen overnight. It creeps on us. And if we're not conscious and if we don't critique and unpack it, it will become the normality. So I think when it comes to looking at what's going on today, learning from the very British kind of polite ways which lead to injustice and ultimately down the line can lead to genocide, we have to be really careful of the language of power and how it can dominate us.
Good. Okay, we also, I mean, a big what we're talking about oppression and how we can support, you know, who are the contemporary Mollies today, who are the most vulnerable within our communities, and how can we use this project to support those, in the sense that we may look at, could be looking at trans rights, migrant rights, at migrant sex workers' rights as well. And I want all of us to be thinking about what issues do we want to see addressed and how would we like to see it addressed within the work that we're making. And I was also, before we just talk about that more broadly, I was also wanted just to read you a quote from Pleasure Activism, because for me, part of the Mollies' history is that despite this oppression, they were having a really good time. And so I'm going to read you a bit of Pleasure Activism. Pleasure activism asserts that we all need pleasure and that our social structures must reflect this. In this moment, we must prioritise those most impacted by oppression. Pleasure activists believe that by tapping into the potential goodness in each of us, we could generate justice and liberation, growing and healing abundance where we have been socialised to believe that only scarcity exists. Pleasure activism acts from an analysis that pleasure is a natural, safe, and liberated part of life, and that we can offer each other tools and education to make sure that sex, desire, drugs, connections aren't life-threatening or harming, but life-enriching. Pleasure activism is learning to make justice and liberation the most pleasurable experiences we can have on the planet. And so with that inspiration and thinking about the Mollies and taking kind of inspiration from their riotous, shameless, outrageous, fun-loving, how can we make, how would the Mollies make the revolution irresistible? Has anybody got any thoughts?
I mean, there is, going a little bit back to focus on the pleasure activism and how the concept of pleasure seems to be always, there's like a pleasure is almost the enemy of the oppressive regimes. I've recently watched a video about American white supremacists and the neo-Nazis that they're told not to wank. They're basically told to not masturbate, so they get more and more angry and more violent towards people. So there is, you know, so the pleasure activist seems to be, you know, or the pleasure seems to be the quality which most of the authoritarian regimes or people who have those authoritarian or kind of, you know, fascist views or like, you know, homophobic, whatever, you know, discriminatory views seem to be scared of, because pleasure makes people a little bit more happy and they cannot be controlled. So that's something which really struck me recently. Like, you have 21st century and those boys, you know, those white supremacy boys are told not to masturbate, so they'll be more, you know, manly, more angry, which is weird.
Yes.
it's sad in a way. So
Sue.
Yeah, I don't know if this is the right time to say this, but I saw some opposite of the thing that is it Jarek had seen, and it was Who Killed Marsha P. Johnson. Has anybody else seen that?
Yeah.
It's absolutely amazing. It's about a transsexual, transvestite person called Marsha P. Johnson, who was murdered in New York in 1997, I think it was. And what got to me was, it was amazing to see the joy and the activity and things that happened in New York with Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera. But there was such tragedy behind it, especially in relation to Sylvia Rivera, because she was homeless, she had an alcohol problem, and was really defeated by Marsha's death, things that happen in it. But it's an amazing thing to watch because it has that underside of on the front, your life is this absolutely joyful, exciting thing that draws other people to you by your activism, by your actions, by your style, by your music. But underneath is this poverty and, you know, the alienation by the rest of the world. That's just something I thought I'd share with you. Okay.
It really resonates with the bit of Dan's book that I've just read, that I'm hoping that you're going to read a little extract from. Dan has just written a book, United Queerdom. So hopefully you can share with that in a minute. But before we do, has anybody else got any responses to how we can make the revolution irresistible? Or even thoughts or connections on the site of the Reformation of Manners?
Yes.
Or things?
Thanks. I was like, oh no, how do I make it irresistible? That wasn't what I was going to talk about. But I just thought, in terms of pleasure activism, it feels kind of like there are so many layers which are like sort of there's exciting potential, and there's also such potential danger, because of course we're always looking at how other people live, and in doing that there's some kind of judgment on how they're living. And when I think of who the oppressors are now around the world and historically, there's a question about who gets to say what pleasure is and what forms of pleasure are acceptable. And I had sort of have this feeling that, just seeing now, like all of the sort of hate messages on social media and stuff, I just have this feeling that there's something so basic about, like, what is pleasure for those people? What is those people's pleasure? What kind of pleasure are they connecting to? Do they have any pleasure? How do they really feel about themselves when they're masturbating? Like that's such a huge systemic thing, like how do we relate to each other? How do we relate to our own bodies? Like, but it feels like there's a sort of, I guess in a similar way to the Black Lives Matter movement now, this sort of realization of how systemic the change has to be. You can't say that unless there is this huge systemic change, then we continue to look at people in little groups and kind of define what each little group does, as opposed to just saying like everybody can do whatever they want and it's all fine. So yeah, kind of allowing, I feel like it was just a response to the pleasure activism and the idea that, like, I absolutely agree that the most oppressed people have to be prioritized in being given voices and permitted to access pleasure of whatever kind they desire. And at the same time, maybe the way that we achieve that is by allowing the oppressors to connect to pleasure in a way that they don't even realize they don't in the first place, That was a long roundabout way of
That was great.
communicating.
Have you got John?
Yeah, I mean, this may just be an indication of just kind of the randomness or kind of the way that my brain works. I'm coming at a bit of a tangent, but I think in kind of context, something that's more kind of sort of face to face and that's sensual and that's kind of very much for me about pleasure, is the experience of fake fur. And kind of right, basically, because immediately it's really, for me, my experience of it is it's very unchallenging, it's very non-threatening, it's very hard when there's any kind of fake fur involved in anything for me to kind of feel that I'm in a place of hostility, which I think you may get a sense of that by kind of just looking at what I'm sitting on, which I've had very treasured. And just, I mean, I'm not quite sure where or how or kind of what, but I've just got this sort of sense of, if you've got in some sort of thing within, whether it's in the context of a ball or some sort of happening or something, that if you're doing something, that there's something about somebody who's dressed in kind of fake fur, for example, that immediately kind of takes away a power of hostility and imbues with a power of some sort of degree of accessibility and welcome and warmth and play and childhood, and going back to that kind of thing of like, nobody, my belief is that nobody was born a racist, nobody was born homophobic, nobody was born with an innate sense of kind of difference and other. And I think that's perhaps what it's kind of tapping into for me as well. And also just in the terms of kind of what you can do with colour and so on. So I'm not quite sure where to kind of go with that, but I've got a strong sense in terms of the consensuality and so on of it.
I think that's great. Me and Lou was in a lecture together yesterday, or the day before, on 18th century furniture. Which sounds dull, but it was amazing. And one of the, I always thought 18th century furniture was a bit gaudy. Do you know what I mean? When you go to a stately house and you're like, ugh. But actually I was really into it. And one of the things the guy was doing was looking at the shapes of things, and he was going, look, your eyes never stop moving. And I was like, oh yes, oh, look at this. And there is something about the period was about pleasure, and it was and sensations. And so I think the fake fur thing is amazing. And it's also, do you know what I mean, queer culture is really famous for being fabulous. Do you know what I mean? That's definitely something that I think we can take from and make it absolutely, especially after Corona, and we've all been locked inside, to make something as pleasurable and enjoyable as possible in all the art that we're creating. But yeah, it's also just popping back to what Dan was saying about this internalized repression. I think it is really useful as a study of this period for understanding where the ideas come from today, like you were saying about contagion, but also is thinking about within the workhouses, sometimes single mothers had to wear distinctive uniforms, about how, and to look at that, and to look at how their humanity was stripped of them because they dared have a child without a man. And that where we are now, when we use the language of Vicky Pollard, or in America the welfare queen, do you know what I mean, that actually where does this stem back from? And also to which I hope we're going to pick up on soon, is the history of slavery. That a documentary that I watched this week was talking about how many people claimed when abolition was announced, how many individuals from the UK put in a claim for slaves. It was 46,000. Now that's loads, do you know what I mean? And that's just not individuals, that was nearly 1 million slaves. So some people had a document and they were I had 5, I had 4, I had 3, literally that's not just the upper classes, that's the classes as well. Do you know what I mean? On how much of our country the country that we live in has been built on the slave trade. And I think it's a really important era, this whole era, for us to be understanding the contemporary world that we live in, because so much, particularly, I hope that also we're going to look at capitalism. Do you know what I mean? That essentially this comes down to money and how much do people cost. So yeah.
Also on capitalism, if we were much more satisfied and having much more pleasure, we'd probably spend less time buying stuff on Amazon. So I don't think there's many vested interests for us to have much pleasure, to be honest. And picking up on what you were saying, Dan, about dictatorships and Holocaust, and first they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out. In terms of sex workers today, the laws in the US, the Sester-Foster laws that were meant to target trafficking, shut down hundreds and all the biggest online porn websites overnight. There's a long established history over the last 20, 25 years of laws policing internet data and people's and the open sourceness of that data and people's agency over their own data on the internet always being tried out on porn first. So they always come for the sex workers and for the porn studios first, because they're the people who are least likely to have public support to stop any draconian laws coming in that really damage the way people control their own data. And so just as a lived example that we're all affected by, I guess, was when the Sester-Foster laws came in, which required they required like lots of sex workers to give in their passport details, so they're much more likely to be policed and deported or not allowed to work because of their passport status and that kind of thing. Required lots of change. The effect was lots of words became banned words on the main platforms like Instagram, which meant that people couldn't have their content discovered by everyday people in the public if it had certain hashtags. And because of the way the robots and the algorithms work, one of those hashtags became the hashtag girl. So anyone who used girl on their picture as a descriptor would not appear recommended to anyone, because girl was seen by the robots as a lewd term, as a pornographic word, which I find really shocking. But it just illustrates the point that they first come for the sex workers, and then those laws eventually will end up affecting all of us and affecting all of our rights, certainly in the online realm.
Mm-hmm. Anybody else got any thoughts? Just going to check the time.
Can I just come in?
Yeah.
Yeah. I just think having this conversation now is so poignant, because I'm guessing that majority of us work in arts and culture, and just with the impacts of the pandemic on all kinds of cultural and artistic institutions, obviously means that majority of the acceptable ways that we can express issues of public importance, of life and love and liberty, are all going to be shut down for the foreseeable, because of course they're not a priority for the turbo-capitalist government that we exist within. So it's even more important that we find alternative ways to express issues of cultural and public importance. And I think in terms of the modern parallels of the institutions and the cultural events that the Society for Reformation of Good Manners, modern manifestations, would impact now, I think not just about the kind of, clubs and bars and raves and countercultures, which they've already suppressed since the Criminal Justice Bill and onto the Coronavirus Bill that we find, but for major public events, which they which they definitely try and depoliticize, pacify, whether that's Notting Hill Carnival, which the establishment have been trying forever since it began to shut down. And of course, it's not happening this year. And probably next year, they'll try and do everything they can to stop it by saying that it's spreading the coronavirus when, they don't think twice about opening up the financial district. But just to give a very pertinent example to now, obviously it's Pride Month, and Pride isn't happening now on June the 27th. And I think when we think about the crackdown on perverted cultures, it's not the major events, but how in a more insidious form they're depoliticized, like Pride has been so rapidly, mainly since 2004, when it was decided that it's not going to be a protest but a parade now, and that's why the trade unions get moved to the back and Barclays get moved to the front. Barclays bankified. And this year is obviously the 50th anniversary of the Gay Liberation Front, who started Pride, not like Tesco as most commonly kind of believed at the moment. And I'm just taking my jacket off, because if we're talking about an example of pleasure activism, this tattoo meets Sister Mayhem, and that's a tribute to the Gay Liberation Front. Stuart Feather's book, which I've got up there, which I won't get because I'll break the computer, is called Blowing the Lid. Stuart Feather was one of the original founding members of the Gay Liberation Front. And 50 years ago, along with other activists from the Gay Liberation Front, also who were working in solidarity with the Black Power movement, the Women's Liberation Front, who were all part of a reciprocal intersectional movement back then. The Gay Liberation Front was actually formed out of Huey Newton from the Black Panthers speech in America. We'll talk about that another time. But anyway, this action, they invaded a homophobic religious festival called the Festival of Light, which was touring around the UK. And in Methodist Central Hall in Parliament Square, along with other activists, the GLFers dressed up as nuns to get into the festival, and then invaded the stage, and under their habits...
Mary Whitehouse.
Yes, yeah, to challenge Mary
It
Whitehouse.
was Mary Whitehouse.
Yeah, to release, and they released mice on the stage, and everyone had to evacuate, and hence they shut down the religious homophobic dialogue perpetuated by Mary Whitehouse and the whole festival that was in, it was following that. So I think that's one of my most inspiring actions about using theatre, cabaret, dance as a form of direct action. And I'm actually meeting one of the GLFers at a distance this evening to just find out what we're going to do on June the 27th. They might want to recreate the original route that they walked 50 years ago.
I'm just gonna notice the time, like it's 3:05, so we're gonna finish soon. I was just gonna say that we will be in touch soon as far as like what we're going to be doing as far as a real life queer tours that will be going to be starting in September, and also in 2 weeks time I'm going to be talking to Lou about 18th century dresses and other stuff. It will probably have a sexier title than that, but we haven't worked that one out yet. But before we do as well, just to finish, if people have to go, that's fine, but I was wondering, Dan, if you could read us an extract from your book.
Yes, I'll read just a very short paragraph. It's in tribute to the Gay Liberation Front, who are obviously like the modern Mollies of today and living legends, the one who is still with us. And it's in response to an event that they led 2 years ago called Auntie Sharon, which is to commemorate all the people in maybe our biological ancestry, in our queer spiritual communities, in our queer heritage, who we will never find out about because they've been lobotomized, because they've been imprisoned, because they committed suicide, because of institutional homophobia, internalized homophobia. So it was an event to really pay tribute to everyone in our heritage who has never been commemorated. Anyway, this paragraph kind of explains a bit of the lineup on the night. One speaker to go, and I winked at Andrew, who was one of the founders of the Gay Liberation Front. It was his time to stand up. In 1970, Andrew was a journalist at the Times in Fleet Street. The first demo for the Gay Liberation Front was in Highbury Fields on the 27th of November. And Andrew read about it and thought, I've got to get down there, and joined the Gay Liberation Front the following Wednesday. He suggested that the country needed an LGBT newspaper and urged it to be called Gay News. Gay then being the defiant new term covering all genders and all queers. It became the first legal LGBT plus paper since partial decriminalisation of homosexuality in 1967. He knew about the homophobic persecution Auntie Sharon brought to life that night, as he recalled 1960s gay clubs where you were not allowed to touch while dancing. He and the GLF were hounded by the police for their radical drag stunts and dressing up as nuns in Albert Hall, shutting down queerphobic religious festivals and bookstores selling material that medicalised homosexuality as a sin. Creating radical drag communes, underground queer literature networks and gay days in public parks. The GLF urged the queer community to unite around a simple set of demands. Self-made pamphlets, zines and newsletters with the DIY vehicles that help forge solidarity of thought, galvanizing citizens who refuse to remain silent, and ultimately propelling forward the movement for the emancipation of queer people. These called for an end to discrimination against homosexuals in employment and sex education, and confronted the unequal age of consent and the pathologization of sexual and gender difference by the medical establishment. I won't go on. I think. Oh, last bit. He then faced the audience quite a long list of those who were with us and who aren't now, and particularly people who he'd recently lost to HIV/AIDS or hepatitis. The crowd went completely silent as he began to describe the liberated 1960s for the heterosexual community as a nightmare of a world for queers and minorities, full of secrecy and fear. Things have changed now, he said.
Thank you, Dan.
Oh, and how can we buy your book? Oh, thanks, Nina. It's on Zed Books, and it's called United Queerdom I'll send a link here, from the legends of the gay liberation front to the queers of tomorrow. We've got a launch, the official launch is on, I'll also send the link. I should know this. I think it's the 24th or 25th. No, it's the 24th. And we've got activists from ACT UP Women who have done a great range of like pleasurable actions. And then on the 25th, I'm really excited about this as well. We've got a launch with a new gay and lesbian centre, along with Black Lives Matter activists, and all donations go to Black Lives Matter. So I'll send everyone the links. We could go on. Thanks so much, Ray and Stuart, for organising today and for everyone to come. I'll write my email down there as well.
Okay, great. All right, thank you everybody for coming. Okay, and we'll see you all in 2 weeks. Okay.
Loads of love.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good luck, everyone. Keep your spirits up.
Thank you.